Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Film Studies online discussion of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? We're very happy that you're joining us, and we are all, I'm sure, very pleased to be joined by Paul Wright of Cabrini University. Paul, how are you tonight?
Doing well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Thanks for suggesting we revisit this movie, one that I hadn't seen since it was big, as they say, and I'm glad I did. There's a lot to chew on. So thanks very much. I look forward to getting into it with folks. But before we do that, we should go over the procedures a little bit. Please keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question or making a comment. You will know it is your turn to ask a question or make a comment because I will call on you. And I will know to call on you because you will hopefully please use the raise hand function within Zoom. And then I will get to you and you can make your points. Also, we will be using the chat window. So if you want to introduce yourself in there, let us know where you're from. If you're from outside this area or joining us for the first time, or you have some other thoughts you want to share with the group, go ahead in there and discuss. And if anything sort of percolates up from there, Paul or I will try to bring it back into the larger discussion. So with that, I think we are ready to get started. And I see we have the Glussmans to start us off.
Okay, I had to get unmuted there. So, Paul, this was certainly fun, unusual, and a lot to dissect. I'm going to go through just two or three of my highlights and see if I can sort of seed your thoughts there, and then we'll let everybody else chime in. You mentioned the music, and the bluegrass music was just fun to listen to. I couldn't decide what it was reminding me of until I looked at some of the reviews, and then it hit me like there was a little bit of Bonnie and Clyde kinds of feeling as we were listening. I sort of enjoyed that, and you had sort of keyed up the idea of the music in the first place. I also was just astounded by Clooney, and one of the quotes that I loved was that, you know, McGill was sort of Clooney as if Clark Gable was a patent medicine salesman. And just after I read that, it just put Clooney so much into focus in how he was doing this. I also, you know, I usually love the Coen brothers stuff that you guys throw at us. I thought that this was a little disorganized, and I'd love to hear the two of you sort of comment or critique the way it was shot and then edited, whether my view of chaos was something that they completely planned, or was it something less than perfect? And lastly, that the scene of the sirens, you know, it was sensual and sexual without any of the traditional sexy. And I thought that was a really interesting way to take this back from ancient Odyssey into today. Paul, thank you. Wonderful film to watch, and love to hear some of your comments.
So, Paul, do you want to, pick one and start running with it?
Sure. There's so much there. Thank you for those comments. They're all spot on. I'll just say two things and then pass the baton to Andrew, and then we can keep passing it. First of all, Andrew mentioned what fun it was to revisit this movie. And in the comments we just heard, I think you heard the joy of watching the film, which is bound up with the music, but the performances and everything else as well. And I felt like we needed, you know, given the last 2 years and particularly the last month, we needed a movie to have some joy with, even though it's touching on serious themes as well, but it's fundamentally entertainment, and I think doesn't apologize for being that. This idea of the film's kind of chaotic style, I understand where you're coming from on that. In fact, I would mostly agree, except to say maybe that I think there's some design there. I think the film is meant to feel like an improvisation that doesn't take itself too seriously, even in the process of adapting Homer. So I think that's the spirit with which the film was shot, the spirit with which the film was edited, the spirit in which it's presented to you. So I think a bit of chaos is actually, at least for me, welcome compared to a lot of other films, even some other Coen brother films. And then the other point you mentioned, which I think I talked a little about in my video introduction, is George Clooney and his performance here, which I found back in 2000 when the film came out, a bit of a revelation, because I was the biggest George Clooney skeptic. I wasn't a huge fan of ER. I understood what he was doing, trying to go from the small screen to the big screen. But to that point, he really hadn't had much success. In fact, he had courted plenty of derision for working with Joel Schumacher. We were just talking about him earlier, Andrew, on one of the Batman movies. And by his own account, George Clooney, to this day, says, I was the worst Batman. And I didn't do a good job with that film. So this was a guy who was kind of floundering, right? He was looking for, box office notoriety and success. And the Coens, more than might seem the case right now, the Coens took a bit of a chance on him, I think, and found his comedic chops, which are just amazing. And that's been proven again and again over the years. And you mentioned Clark Gable. That was certainly who came to my mind the first time I watched the film. It was clear Clooney was channeling him, but also making the part of Ulysses Everett McGill all his own. So I agree with you. Andrew, did you want to pick up on anything?
Yeah, I think the stuff about Clooney is a good reminder of what directors do, what their one, if not their primary. We sometimes forget, with our focus on visual style and our focus on, authorship, we sometimes forget that directors' first job is to guide the actors in their performances, which, depending on the movie and depending on the actor, can be quite a challenge because movies are not shot in sequence, for one thing. And now there are other people besides the director to remind the actor sort of where they are in their emotional arc or whatever. But in terms of helping the actors sort of, hone their character, I mean, that's one of the things the director is really supposed to do. And frankly, the directors have, they're the ones in the outfit who are supposed to know at least what everyone else is doing. So you could imagine a movie like this where clearly Ulysses Everett McGill is a character, and it's a character we're supposed to recognize as a character, but we're supposed to believe that character is real enough to care when he's, when the sheriff or when the law finds them, or when he is crestfallen that his wife's going to marry someone else, or what have you. And so to calibrate that, and especially a relatively inexperienced at this point movie actor, to help them calibrate that to make the performance big enough that it's as entertaining as we all found it, but small enough so we don't simply see a caricature and forget there's a person there. And that's something a director would help with and be able to calibrate. Now the actor has to have the raw materials to be able to make those adjustments, but the director's there helping guide in the adjustment. And I think that regarding the sort of, scattershot nature of this, I think that this is an episodic movie. And I think that there are a number of fair to good reasons for that. I think one is it's based on the Odyssey, and the Odyssey was episodic in its way, and arguably was a collection of stories from a bunch of different people in a bunch of different eras that Homer pulled together. So there's that. The movie on which, I shouldn't say on which this is based, but the movie that inspired this, at least gave them the title for this, Sullivan's Travels, the Preston Sturges movie, is episodic as well. And I think the Coen brothers, sometimes, they make their movies can have an episodic nature to them, particularly when they're movies about characters that are put upon, right? I mean, I think you could see, A Serious Man had some episodic elements to it. Certainly The Big Lebowski had episodic elements to it. Even Fargo, to a degree, the way it sort of moves around in the different, following the different sort of protagonists. And Well, I would say that that is typically something that I would be, I'll speak for myself, something I would be critical of in a movie. I think there are times when it's appropriate. And I think, this movie might not hang together as the most cohesive feature film in the Coen brothers oeuvre, but I think that I think it fits with the tone and the perspective. I mean, we know we're being told the story, right? We meet the sort of the man on the lone man on the train tracks in the beginning. We see him at the end. This is all sort of set up to be a fable, and fables have different episodes which teach us different things. So it sort of makes sense, but it's a fair criticism. If you weren't going to make a feature film, it should hang together. So it's a fair criticism if it doesn't.
Can I build on that for a minute, Andrew?
Sure.
Because I love the emphasis you're putting here on the episodic nature of this by design, I would say. And the fact that actually honors the Homeric tradition and the Odyssey itself a lot more than you might think. I mean, revisit Homer and you'll feel sometimes you're not sure where this author is going with it. And first of all, it's not one author, right? Homer's a composite figure. It's really a complex oral and later written tradition of storytelling that now the Coen brothers are part of, which I think is fascinating. There is the question of how much the Coen brothers really thought about Homer when they were making this. There's also the claim by some that they hadn't read it at all. I think I mentioned this in the video intro, that it might be the case that Tim Blake Nelson was the best read simply because he was a classics major as a university student. There is some evidence out there in some interviews, though, that Ethan actually knows the story better than he's claiming. So I wonder to what degree the Coens are having fun with us yet again by saying, yeah, we didn't really read it. We didn't take it that seriously. We just decided to adapt it anyway. But that episodic quality, I think, if it's what you're in the mood for in a given viewing, it really hits home and it works. But if you're looking for something more traditionally structured, that's not what you're going to get. Andrew, go ahead if you wanted to say anything else.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Joss, what are your questions or comments?
Okay, well, first of all, Paul, thank you for your introductory video. You hit on many of the things that came to mind as I watched this. And I enjoyed it watching it now as much as I did when it first came out 20 some odd years ago. It was just, as you have said repeatedly, it was fun. I didn't find the episodic nature of it a problem at all. That was integral to the whole enjoyment of this movie. What's going to happen to them next, kind of thing, and how are they going to wheel their way out of the next dilemma? So that was fine. You've spoken about the music. You spoke about it eloquently in your introductory, Paul. And you talked about the affection for the music and the affection for the place and the people. I just want to remember those things that you said. To get to a couple of other things. First of all, the performances. You've talked about Clooney. I thoroughly enjoyed Tim Blake Nelson. This was the first time I had ever encountered him when I saw this film, and he was just delightful. And every time I see him in a film, I say, "Oh, great! There he is again. What's he going to do now?" So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about his work here, before and after. I would also comment in terms of the episodic nature and the fun of this film. Where did they get the beards? I'm not going to say any more about that. And one thing that you only mentioned briefly, Andrew, was the visual style. And the visual style of this movie is not trivial. The color palette was also a major feature of this film, of this concept. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. So Tim Blake Nelson and the color palette, the beards, that was just funny. Okay. Any thoughts you have?
Thanks, Joss. I mean, the first thought about the visuals is this is shot by the great Roger Deakins, who made a number of movies with the Coens and is probably, arguably the most in-demand cinematographer, or at least has been over the last 20 years working in Hollywood today. One of the things I know about this film that's very interesting is the amount of post-production adjustment that went into getting the color palette just right. And that's not a criticism of Deakins, and that's not at the expense of his work. I mean, he's deeply involved in getting the colors. When you're looking at something that is at once as vivid and desaturated as the images in this movie are, the physical, because this was at a time when they were still shooting on film, the physical process of shooting on celluloid can only get you so far. And then you go to the digital world to get you even further. And I think that's part of it. It's just stunning to me that something that we've all seen 100 times before, which is namely sort of, desaturation, a hybrid of desaturation and sepia, for lack of a better term, being used to give us a sense of a hot, old, dry area. For that, which has been standard operating procedure for at least 30 years by the time this movie came out, to somehow still seem vivid and interesting is a testament to Deakins and to the Coens' vision as well. Paul, you must have something to add.
Well, no, that was beautifully stated. The achievement of Deakins in this film and in so many other films, which took forever to be rewarded by the Academy. It was fairly recently that he finally picked up his Oscar, even though it seemed like he'd been earning one for the last 20 years. I wouldn't have much to add to that. The mention of Tim Blake Nelson, though, I perked up at that. His performance in this film is as important and as good as anyone else's. And Nelson, is a very accomplished playwright, writer, director, actor, of course, a really thoughtful person who doesn't just rush to do anything and do it halfway or do it haphazardly. Even a role like this, which a lot of other actors would have just, dumbed down to a point of ridiculousness, somehow works in the hands of Tim Blake Nelson, even though the character is not all that bright. And I think he brings so much humanity to the part, along with Turturro and everyone else. Nelson also has the distinction in this cast of being the one who can actually sing, or at least whose voice was kept in the final cut. His take on In the Jailhouse now at the end of the movie, that's Tim Blake Nelson, and he really sells it. The other actors had a harder time. They had thought at one point that Clooney might actually sing Man of Constant Sorrow, and they tried that out, but it just didn't work. And everyone, including Clooney, just said, I'm not a singer. We shouldn't mess around with this. This needs to sound good. This is the part that I can't do as George Clooney, but that a real singer can bring home, namely the Man of Constant Sorrow.
Yeah, Tim Blake Nelson came to BMFI once, and he really, as Paul said, is a Renaissance man in that he is involved with and creates and is good at creating lots of different types of art. And he talked about being a classics major and how it was more useful to him than he would have thought in writing plays and becoming a filmmaker in his own right. And it also certainly helped him, as you mentioned, Paul, with this movie. We don't have any other hands up, which I find absolutely stunning. But I know that the Glussmans always have something to say. So
Got
David, we'll go back to you. Oh,
one thing
sure.
to add on Nelson, and then we can get to David's question. And Andrew, I'm sure you know this film too. Talk about adaptations that are serious and yet in their own way innovative, much like the Coens adapting Homer or anything else. Tim Blake Nelson did a fine film called O, which is his take on Othello set in a high school, here in our modern world. And that's a really thoughtful film tackling a pretty tough subject and a pretty important play. So Nelson, I look forward to whatever he does. He doesn't rush to put things out, but when he does, it's going to be thoughtful.
And David.
So there were two other things that I was trying to understand, and maybe you can shed some light, and they both have to do with the South directly and indirectly. The whole piece about the Klan was amazingly done in that the Klan is almost a third rail subject, and yet they managed to pull it off in a way that showed the seriousness and at the same time comedic. And that was part of my thought or question that I didn't find any research when I checked, is whether the Coen brothers had any particular history or connection to the South, and that whole scene with the Southern politics from the time. I thought that was a really interesting thing to throw in along with all of these other scenes that I guess we sort of agreed at a certain level were appropriate and controlled chaos. But the South and politics and the Klan, is there anything about their background that made them come and take those pieces and throw that in?
So I'll take a stab at that. The Coens grew up in Minnesota, and therefore you might assume, for good reasons, that the films of theirs that are closest to their hearts and their upbringing would be things like Fargo and perhaps above all, A Serious Man, a film I absolutely adore. Growing up Jewish, in Minnesota was really formative in all kinds of ways, as you can imagine, for them. So setting a film in the rural South of the past might seem, as far away as possible from what the Coens knew growing up. But if you think about them being Jewish in that environment and confronting everything they must have confronted every day of their lives, perhaps, this meditation on the racism of the South wasn't as distant as it might seem at first glance. I also think they pride themselves as filmmakers on being able to enter any milieu, any environment, and find a way to discover the drama in it, the humor in it, the playfulness in it, the frightening elements of it. They know how to inhabit a space and bring people to life and bring turns of phrase to life, bring language to life, regardless of the setting, in a way that I think few other filmmakers are capable of. And so in a way, I think it was a challenge that they wanted to take on, right? We can make a film about the South just as well as anyone else can. They did describe what they were trying to do. I have this from an interview. They said, this is Lawrence of Arabia, the Lawrence of Arabia of hayseed movies. A ma and pa kettle movie with really high production values, a sophisticated Three Stooges film. Now that's the Coens being disingenuous and not exactly confronting head on what you are in your question, right? Particularly about the Klan rally and the role of the Klan and racism in the film, which is, I think, more troubling and serious than the Coens are letting on in comments like that. One critic described that Klan rally with the dance as a choreographed melange of the Wizard of Oz, Busby Berkeley, and a Nuremberg rally. And I think that's pretty accurate in terms of what they were going for in those scenes, which I think, if they didn't have final cut, I bet someone would have said, hey, this is a fun movie. Why don't you take that stuff out? That's a little too dark for us. But thankfully they did have final cut and could leave that in, because I think those really serious moments in the film leaven what is otherwise a pure farce and is more than just the Lawrence of Arabia of hayseed movies. Andrew, I don't know if you have thoughts in that regard as well.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think you're right that they, you know, they certainly would have, you know, growing up in the Midwest, they certainly would have at least had a familiarity with the Klan from the news, perhaps from when there was the March in Skokie, which would have been happening when they were growing up, and is another upper Midwestern state. I also think that something that the Coens do that forever impresses me, even in their movies that I don't think work on all levels. The thing that I don't think I've ever seen them fail at is capturing a time and a place in America. And to me, it's just absolutely stunning how good they are at it. And they can't do this without the costumers they work with and the production designers they work with and all that, but how they, you know, as the sort of CEOs of those movies, how they know how to, when they see it, that they are capturing, you know, Washington, D.C. in the 90s, or, you know, Minnesota, North Dakota in the 80s, or whatever it is. And I think that they are better at anyone, with the possible exception of Wes Anderson, at creating thoroughly credible and permeating atmosphere, but they're creating different ones in each movie. And that's harder to do. Wes Anderson can do Wes Anderson better than anybody, but they're doing different places and different times. And the thing that I guess sort of puzzles me about the Coens in my view of sort of film history and criticism is that, you know, I've sort of been conditioned, as many of us have, that if they're really top flight filmmakers, as many of us think they are, there has to be a consistency across their work that exists in the work of a Scorsese or a Spielberg. He has two different tracks, but there's a consistency within those tracks, for example, or a John Ford or a Hitchcock or whoever. And it's harder with them. They're much more like Billy Wilder in that regard, one of their influences. But I think that the thing you can say about them is how they so thoroughly depict a time and a place. Now, I'm not saying that they always do that with incredible historical accuracy, but they do it with a thoroughness and a consistency throughout the whole film that takes a commitment and I think an impressive sense of eye and sound and so on. And this movie, to me, is less about, I see this movie, I don't think I'm seeing what Mississippi was like in the 1930s. I think I'm seeing what everything that Hollywood has told us Mississippi was like in the 1930s. And I see, All the King's Men in this, and I see the Defiant Ones in this, and I see I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang in this, and I see Cool Hand Luke in this. And, I'm talking about 40 years of Hollywood history, and being able to sort of synthesize that from all those different filmmakers and periods and genres into this depiction. I think that's really something. And to me, that's what they're doing more effectively and more comprehensively. Just because of their nature, I wouldn't trust the historical accuracy. I mean, they're not interested in telling us the truth. They're not even interested in telling us the truth about whether they're telling us the truth. So I don't expect that from them. And that's fine. That's not their, there's plenty of people who want to make sure that that's the actual plate the guy would have had in the restaurant at the time. But giving us that sense of it, I think, is an achievement in and of itself.
Andrew, I would just add to that the Coens, I think, in all their films, this one in particular, are creating a kind of mythopoetic space, which is rooted in cinema, right? Rooted in cinema's tropes about whatever place the story happens to be set in this case, the Old South. And I agree with you, they're not going for a truth with a capital T of the sort that an historian would appreciate or someone else would be looking for. I think they are at times, though, perhaps without fully intending it, revealing small t truths about the places they look at and revealing the kind of dark underbelly of what on the surface might seem to be old school gentility or playfulness, right? Just beneath the surface of that in this movie is a state apparatus that will hunt you down even after you've been exonerated by the governor, right? You have the Klan not only just beneath the surface, but actively trying to take over the governor's house in this film. And so if you were to just describe those things, right, we all know those things have happened, not precisely in the way the Coens tell it, but they've happened. And so the Coens can allude to all of that playfully and still retain their whimsy somehow. And I think this is what separates them from Wes Anderson, right? For me, Wes Anderson works most of the time, but one thing he is 24/7 is whimsy, right? The Coens have that too, but they never forget to leaven the whimsy with a knife's edge, right? There's always something just beneath the surface of their films. And the filmmaker that they remind me of, at least in response to Andrew's great assessment of them here, would be not the other people he was distinguishing them from, but Stanley Kubrick. And I don't mean that in every single respect. They're very different filmmakers in 20 ways we could itemize. But one thing that I think the Coens and Kubrick have in common is this desire to inhabit a place that they haven't been to as filmmakers before. And the more kind of outlandish that new place can be, the more freedom it seems they have to explore and to make it their own. And in that one respect, I think that's something they have in common with Kubrick, and maybe also have in common with Kubrick, the knife's edge, right? The bitter undertone of so much of what's being discussed in a Kubrick film, for example, like Strangelove, right? We all know what a dark and disturbing movie that is, while also being hilariously funny. And I think the Coens are sometimes going for that, or maybe not going for it, but they somehow achieve it.
See, the thing, I don't disagree with that. I think my personal experience with Kubrick, though, is that he's the last thing he wants to do is make things familiar to me as a viewer. Even when he's depicting things in a place that I've been or that I'm familiar with or that I can imagine or that's like a place I've been, he doesn't want it to seem familiar. On the other end of the spectrum, the Coens, no matter where their movie's set or what it's about, they find a way to put something in there that most people or the average person will recognize, right? I've never been to the Depression era South, but toward the end, when George Clooney goes to this incredible ordeal to get a ring and it's the wrong ring. I mean, I've been there where, my son said, can you go get me this toy? And I go dig through his chest to get it, and it's the wrong toy. Like we've been there, right? And so they relish in those moments. And it's different than universality. I mean, there are universal themes in this movie, of course, but those things that you'll recognize, even if you haven't been in that time in that place, that's one of the things they're so good at.
I would agree with that distinction completely. I do think, Kubrick is almost like Bertolt Brecht. He's trying to alienate you from everything you thought you knew about a place and a people, including the human species, right? So There's something, they like to say the Coens are the misanthropes. I think Kubrick's a lot closer to a misanthrope than the Coens ever are. And I think part of the reason for that is what you so rightly described, is the Coens will always find a way to give you a hook or a lifeline or some kind of comfort food along the way. And usually it's drawn from cinema, right? From tropes that we recognize from storytelling on the big screen of the past. Or even if we don't know the films they're riffing on, right? We've heard those stories. We know those tropes. And that's maybe the comfort food that helps the rest of the film go down. If there's any medicine in it, I don't know. But we come away not I don't come away from any Coen Brothers movie completely devastated the way I do from almost any Stanley Kubrick movie.
Yeah, I'd second all that. Diane, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking of Jean Valjean, Les Miserables, when this whole notion of this guy going after them all the time, and I also kind of felt there was maybe a biblical reference. The guy that was at the beginning and the end on the track, he was kind of like a prophet.
Yeah.
He knew, he was telling them what was going to happen, and in fact, it did happen exactly the way he said it was going to happen. And there he was at the end again. I really thought it was adorable.
And he's also a Homeric figure, right? Because he's blind, which is traditionally how we think of this composite figure, Homer, right? To the extent we personify him, right? We think of him as the blind poet. And then later you have John Milton riffing on Homer as the blind poet. But I agree with you. There's also there's a strong biblical strain in a lot of this to go alongside everything else. The Coens are never happy unless they're blending literary traditions, cinematic genres, and a host of other things. And sometimes, like Andrew said earlier, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I think this is one of the films where it works. And you can give the credit for it working to a lot of things, from the performances to the music to the cinematography, you name it. But I think the Coens, when they're given all those other elements, they can really make a true entertainment that is unapologetic about being an entertainment. And this goes back to what I mentioned in the intro video and what Andrew mentioned. Sturges' film, right, Sullivan's Travels, ends with a figure who thought he had to make a socially important movie, realizing that what is really socially important is giving people joy. And I think thematically, that's the through line from that movie to this, even though you would never, as Andrew said, call it an adaptation of Sullivan's Travels.
Yeah, and I think the connection to Les Miserables is an interesting one as well. I mean, in the sense that they're being pursued by a thoroughly tireless and unceasing, figure representing justice, or at least punishment, I guess is a better way to say it. And we don't get as much insight to him as we do the police character in Les Miserables, but we also don't have our characters, our protagonists, living with the fear and the awareness that, I mean, they have the fear of getting caught in general, but they have no idea really the full extent of who they're dealing with until that moment at the end when he finds them and says, I don't have a radio, and that's, I think, what allows this movie to be light. If they were conscious of that how unjust he would be in searching them out and punishing them, if they were consciously aware of that, and we were reminded of that throughout, and indeed, if we were aware of it, I hadn't seen the movie in many years, I really thought they were off the hook, because I assumed that, the governor's pardon would be good enough. That's what allows it to be light. But there is that sense that, there's the rules, and there's what's fair, and there's what's right. And then there's also sometimes what happens. And I mean, that's something else the Coen brothers consistently introduce us to, that even, I mean, call it you want, the best laid plans, or, dotting your I's and crossing your T's, still is no guarantee of success. Your mileage may vary. It may vary by a tremendous amount. And these guys, these three characters, reasonably thought that they had finally triumphed after all the ups and downs. And then it takes what is, we're told is not, which is an act of God, which isn't really an act of God, but an act of the New Deal, which was close to God in those 1930s movies, for them to finally escape.
To your point, Andrew, about them not realizing that the governor's pardon only extends so far, and that Sheriff Cooley's coming for them and probably doesn't much care at all what the governor has said about this. This is a way in which the film is honoring the Greeks to a certain degree, right? Because that sheriff figure, who is a riff on a similar character in Cool Hand Luke, you mentioned that film earlier, right? With the shades and the kind of menace. But he's also a riff on, fate itself, on the inexorable forces of destiny that hunt you down despite all your, best laid plans. And in that way, I think this is a prototypical Coen Brothers movie, because if you think of almost all their films, there are always forces at work, it seems, that either by design or often just by chance and coincidence conspire to ruin everyone's, thoughts about what comes next. And no matter how well they've prepared for their future, there's just something around the corner that can ruin your day regardless, or ruin your life, or destroy your life. And this is something critics of the Coens have talked about, that they have a kind of contempt for the mere mortals who are the victims of their machinations as writers. I don't really see it that way. I don't see it as contempt. I actually think there's a great deal of affection, but there is also this recognition that life is a series of things that are way beyond your understanding and your control. And if there's a consistent Coen Brothers theme, I really think it's that at the end of the day. Now, our characters here, thanks to the New Deal, as Andrew mentioned, they're going to escape the consequences that would befall your, I would say, average Coen Brothers character, who does not escape so easily from what's coming to them.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because there's, I think, more disagreements about sort of the moral valence of movies, to my mind, come about from one key, I won't say misunderstanding, but difference in understanding. And that is the difference between depicting something as something that happens or has happened, and saying that the filmmakers approve, condone, applaud, agree with that. And what Paul was saying made me think of that, because I think that the Coens do often show how cruel fate can be, but that doesn't mean that they're happy about it. It just means that they want to remind us in their stories that that's always out there, and that's something you're all dealing with. But it doesn't necessarily, to me, mean that they're happy that fate so often,
It's not Glee, right? It's not
Right.
Glee.
Right. Yeah. Joss, you had an additional comment or question.
Yes, sort of a musical footnote. We haven't talked about Tommy Johnson and his character, which I assume is directly a reference to Robert Johnson, the great blues man who reputedly met the devil at the crossroads and sold his soul and became a great blues guitarist. Why did they change the name? I mean, this was a story that existed, that was prevalent way before this movie.
Josh, I've read that there are conflicting accounts of whether it was Tommy or Robert or neither, right? That this is just a purely apocryphal story.
Yeah, well, it's apocryphal, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, we hope, we assume.
Well,
Yeah, and the actor rather playing Tommy, Chris Thomas King, he is an accomplished blues artist in his own right. So they definitely wanted to bring in someone who had the real musical chops that
but
the
they
other
didn't
actors
play.
didn't have.
They didn't play that song.
Which one?
Crossroads.
Oh, right.
Which I'm not sure what to make of that, but it would just seem like a grand opportunity that maybe they chose not to take or missed. I don't know.
Yeah, or again, it goes back to them being the riff masters that they are, right?
Yeah.
This is an episodic story told in broad strokes with illusions that, don't always go where you expect. And I felt the same way. There were certain things I wanted developed more, mostly in the vein of the classical illusions. But then at the end of the day, it didn't take me long, even on the first viewing of this movie, to realize that if I was going to hold them to a imaginary academic standard of an adaptation of Homer, that I was in the wrong movie, right?
Oh, no,
And
that's not this film. Not at
yeah,
all.
exactly. And I very quickly surrendered to their vision of it. And it might not be my vision, but it's a vision I appreciate nonetheless.
Yeah. There was just to bring it up, there was a question in the chat from David about whether, and it's unrelated to what we were, but I wanted to see knowledge or thoughts about it, if anybody other than George Clooney was considered for that role.
Andrew, I haven't heard anything suggesting that others were considered, but I'm sure at some point they were. I mean, most films, can't afford to run on the principle that we're going to do this only with this actor or we're not doing it at all. I'm sure they considered others, but I have read that Clooney was very interested in working with them for all the reasons I mentioned earlier. I think they, along with Steven Soderbergh in a film like Out of Sight, right, were the only ones offering a lifeline to the genuinely creative, interesting actor that George Clooney proved himself eventually to be. And I think he was, as I read, willing to do this film without having read the script. Coens by that point, they weren't the Coens yet who won the big prize with No Country for Old Men, but they were the Coens, and people understood that there was going to be a certain kind of pleasure in working with them. And I think Clooney saw this as an opportunity and lobbied, hard for the part, which I imagine they pretty quickly saw that he could, bring home.
Well, and whether they realized it at the beginning or they realized it as they were starting to see actors, they wanted someone who could be that Clark Gable type. And, there's a difference between being a strong Hollywood leading man and being a good actor. Those don't always overlap. I think they have come to overlap in Clooney, but even at this relatively early point, you could see he could at least appear to play the part. And then I think probably so that's part of it. The other thing I remember reading when this movie came out is that the Clooneys are from the Cincinnati area originally, and they have family on both sides of the river there. So some from Kentucky. So George Clooney said he sent the script to uncles, I think, and had them record some of the dialogue on cassette, I guess at the time, because of the Kentucky accent. And so I think, I don't know whether the Coens knew that or not, or whether Clooney had thought of some of that before he met with them or what, but that was something that probably not everybody could convincingly pull off either. But I don't know of any other actors who were up for this.
I had one other comment or question. Another Coen Brothers film that clearly relates to time, place, and setting. We haven't discussed this film, was Buster Scruggs, and then, again with Tim Blake Nelson, but that anthology of a film. Just any thoughts about how that fits into their body of work?
Andrew, have you seen it? I have. I don't know if you've caught that one.
I didn't catch it. No.
Yeah, I think it's the one they did for Netflix, I believe, or made its way to Netflix really fast. I think it had a very limited theatrical release. It is, how best to describe it, it's been a while since I've seen it, an anthology film, I would say, set in the Old West. So it has certain episodic qualities, right, that would echo what we see in Oh Brother, although it's more truly an anthology in the sense that each story is its own self-contained thing. There is some overlap between characters, but for the most part, they're telling a number of different stories. I think of it like a short story collection by the Coen brothers, as opposed to a novel. And Tim Blake Nelson is amazing in it. It also features some storylines in some of the tales in the anthology that are incredibly dark and about the encounter between Native Americans and settlers heading west, and the brutality visited in all directions there. And it's not the kind of playful romp that you usually associate with the Coens. There are some stories in Buster Scruggs that fit that description, but there's also a lot more in the way of darkness. There's even a hint by the end of that movie that some of the characters are on their way to the afterlife, and it's not a pleasant afterlife. So I very much appreciated it, but it's been a while since I've revisited it. I don't know what your experience of it was.
But Buster Scruggs was the 6 somewhat distinct episodes. Janice and I saw it with our you'll pardon the expression, our other movie group, our synagogue, and it was a very interesting way of putting things together, but very, very, very different than our film for tonight, Oh Brother. Yeah,
different in tone altogether. More somber ultimately than Oh Brother ever could be.
Yeah, dark in its way.
Yeah,
but the ideas of fate and destiny and
that's all still there.
Still there, very prominently.
Very much so.
Thanks, Joss. Michael has some further thoughts on Tommy Johnson.
Yeah, I just wanted, I'm a blues musician, and Tommy Johnson was the one who actually claimed to have gone to the crossroads and made a deal with the devil. Robert Johnson never did. Robert Johnson, what happened to him was he got so good in a year that other blues musicians assumed that he had done it, but he never claimed to do it himself.
That's great.
What I thought was interesting about that was that when the musician in the movie played the song, he played a Skip James song, the Hard Time Killing Floor, and which I thought was an interesting choice.
For those of us who aren't so familiar, why was that such an interesting choice?
Well, first of all, it wasn't really even a blues. It's more of a lament, and I would think that since he was playing the character of Tommy Johnson, I mean Tommy Johnson, I've got an anthology of Tommy Johnson. There are any number of Tommy Johnson songs he could have played, and why they went with the Skip James song, I've always found that odd. But on the other hand, it really fits the mood, the campfire mood. So I guess they went with that.
The oversight of the music was left to T-Bone Burnett, and it could be more his choice ultimately than the Coens. And so it'd be fascinating to hear him interviewed, as much as they on the choices made in this film, because the music is just so much a part of it and so much a character in its own right. And I couldn't begin to explain the choices made, but it's great to have someone with a musical background who can speak to it.
Well, I mean, it's a perfect song, and I think he just probably Burnett said, I've got a song. It's from the era, I mean, Skip James was a contemporary of the Johnsons, and it really just fit that scene so well. So I guess I guess like you guys were talking about earlier, sometimes the setting the mood and the effect is more important than strict historical accuracy.
And most of us, like I'll say myself, and I would imagine Paul wouldn't have known who'd written either of those songs, so it wouldn't have jumped out at us as being inaccurate. Right. You have to have your sort of knowledge level probably for that to be clear.
Well, I listen to as much music as you guys watch movies.
Well, that's why. But so if we did both, that would have jumped out at us. But since we don't, it didn't. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah. Thank you.
It appears like we don't have any more questions or comments. So I guess we can wrap things up. I hope everyone enjoyed having the occasion to revisit this movie. As Paul mentioned earlier, it was great to have a bit of a lighter title. We have a lot more film education coming up, as you can see on our screen, a number of seminars that you can attend on site or remotely, and one seminar on short films that is only available remotely, but it's an opportunity to see and discuss some terrific short movies. And we hope to see you back at BMFI in our classes. Paul isn't teaching any of the ones on the screen here, but he's got one coming up in May that we'll be announcing soon. So be sure to keep your eye out for that. We are also obviously open for I forgot to mention this. Yes, our summer filmmaking workshop. If you happen to be in high school or are the parent or grandparent of someone in high school who's interested in filmmaking, our summer filmmaking workshop is back after a pandemic break. So we've got spots open, and the final information session, virtual information session, is on March 28th, where students can meet the instructor and learn more about the program. So go to our website to learn more about this great program if you or someone you know might be interested in spending their summer learning about filmmaking. The theater is open for business. We've got a lot of interesting movies coming and going. We're going to be, I'll let you in on a little sneak peek that will be announced tomorrow. We're going to have the new documentary about automats that you may think I'm being sort of facetious when I say that, but I'm really interested in seeing this. I am old enough to remember automats from when I was a really young kid, and there's a great documentary out about them with a bunch of famous people talking about their memories. That's going to be opening this week at BMFI. We've got something for everyone in addition to that, including the Batman and a host of other interesting international cinema. So please come to the movies and see what we've got going on by going to brynmarfilm.org. And if you like tonight's program or anything else we're doing, we always appreciate your support. To help support free programs like this, as well as the work we do at BMFI, which is not entirely supported by ticket sales or course tuition. We always appreciate donations in whatever form they can come, or become a member. That's a great way to help support us as well. Either way, we thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed tonight's discussion. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks to everyone.
Another great suggestion and another wonderful give and take on the movie. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you next month. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.